In 1913, roughly one person in every four alive on Earth was a subject of the British Empire, around 412 million people. 7 years later, the empire covered about 35.5 million square kilometers, close to a quarter of all the land on the planet. And all of it was administered, in the end, from a cold, wet island off the northwest coast of Europe, an island smaller than a great many of the countries it governed, which 500 years earlier had been a peripheral kingdom of no particular importance to anybody. Tonight we are going to follow that whole story slowly from the beginning to the very end. If you would rather listen with the screen off, this channel is on Spotify too, and the link is sitting in the description below. Before we slow down, tell me where you are listening from tonight and what the clock says there. And now let us take the pace right down. None of this needs you awake. We have 4 or 5 centuries to get through, and I'm going to move gently. And I promise you that nothing here depends on your attention. If you drift off somewhere in the 17th century and come back near the 20th, that is exactly what tonight is for. So let your head settle. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, which is further than you think. Let your hands open. Whatever you carried into this room, you can leave it on the floor beside the bed, and it will still be there in the morning if it turns out to be worth picking up. We are going to cross a lot of water tonight, down to the Caribbean, around the Cape, out to Bengal and Botany Bay in the Gold Coast, and back again. Slowly, one thing at a time, and I will explain everything as we go. Let me start with something very ordinary. A cup of tea, not a special one. An everyday cup, in an everyday kitchen, made the way it has been made in millions of British homes every day for 200 years. The kettle, the bag or the leaves, water just off the boil, a wait of a minute or two, and then milk, and for a great many people, a spoonful of sugar. It is the most domestic object imaginable. It is a byword for ordinariness, for comfort, for nothing much happening. And there is almost nothing in it that is British. The tea plant is not native to Britain. It came originally from China, and for the first 2 centuries of British tea, drinking every leaf was bought from Chinese merchants at Canton. Later, the same plant was grown on an industrial scale in Assam and Ceylon, on plantations worked by laborers, many of them recruited under indenture contracts and moved hundreds or thousands of miles from home. The sugar is not native either. Sugarcane came from New Guinea originally, reached the Mediterranean by way of India and the Arab world, and then crossed the Atlantic to be grown on Caribbean islands, where the labor for roughly 2 centuries was performed by enslaved Africans. Even the porcelain is a borrowed idea, copied from Chinese wares that arrived as ballast in the holds of the same ships that brought the tea. So, a leaf from China, sweetened with the produce of the Caribbean, poured into an imitation of a Chinese cup, drunk in Manchester, and the whole arrangement made possible by ships, by armed force, by chartered companies, and by an enormous amount of other people's labor, most of it unpaid. That is the empire sitting on a kitchen table. I begin there because it is the most honest way in. The British Empire is not something that happened only in far-off places to other people. It reshaped the inside of ordinary British life as thoroughly as it reshaped the places it took, and it did so in ways that became invisible precisely because they became normal, and it is honest in another way too. Because the story of the British Empire is now the subject of a loud and often bad-tempered public argument, one that tends to be conducted as though there were a scoreboard, and the only question were the final total. I am not going to do that tonight. What I am going to do is tell you what happened, in order as accurately as I can, And where historians genuinely disagree, I will tell you that they disagree, and what the disagreement is actually about. Some of what follows is admirable. Some of it is appalling. A great deal of it is simply strange, and much stranger than the version most of us were taught. Here is the question to carry with you, held loosely. How does a small, rainy, thinly populated island on the edge of Europe, with no great army, arriving late to overseas expansion behind Portugal and Spain, end up governing a quarter of the human race? That is a real puzzle. It is not answered by saying the British were clever or greedy or lucky, though there is a case for all three. Let us go and look. We need to start by getting rid of an image. When people imagine England at the beginning of this story, they tend to picture something already grand. Shakespeare, galleons, a queen in an enormous dress. Around the year 1500, England was none of that. It was a kingdom of perhaps 2.5 to 3 million people, which was small. France had 4 or 5 times as many. It had recently spent decades tearing itself apart in a dynastic civil war. It exported wool and not much else. And the most sophisticated finance, shipping, and manufacturing in Europe were happening elsewhere, in Italy and the Low Countries. It was, in the terms of the age, a periphery. And the great age of oceanic exploration then beginning belonged to somebody else entirely. The Portuguese had been working their way down the African coast for most of the 15th century and reached India by sea in 1498. The Spanish crossed the Atlantic in 1492, and within decades were extracting silver from the Americas on a scale that would reshape the world economy. England's contribution in that first generation was one voyage. In 1497, a Venetian navigator named John Cabot, sailing from Bristol under a patent from Henry VII, crossed the North Atlantic and made landfall somewhere on the coast of Newfoundland or Cape Breton. He sailed again the following year and was not heard from with any certainty afterwards. That was more or less it for 50 years. What England did have and what mattered enormously later was geography and a certain kind of poverty. The geography is simple. It is an island, so it can be defended by ships rather than by a large standing army, which is far cheaper and incidentally far less dangerous to the liberties of the people who live there. And it sits on the Atlantic, which was about to become the most important ocean in the world. The poverty is subtler. English monarchs could not raise taxes without Parliament's consent, an arrangement that had grown out of centuries of bargaining. That made the crown weak in one obvious sense. It also meant that when the state did borrow money, the people lending it had representation in the body that guaranteed repayment, and so they trusted it, and so it could borrow at rates that other European monarchies could only envy. Hold that thought. Cheap credit turns out to be one of the quiet engines of the whole story. The first place England practiced colonization was not across an ocean at all. It was next door. The English crown had claimed lordship over Ireland since the 12th century, but for most of that time, actual control extended only over a district around Dublin. In the 16th century, under the Tudors, that changed, and the conquest of Ireland became a sustained project. What went with it was plantation. Land was confiscated from Irish landholders and granted to settlers brought over from England and, later and in far greater numbers, from Scotland, particularly in Ulster from the early 17th century. The vocabulary developed there traveled. The word plantation, the arguments about civilizing, a people described as barbarous, the practice of settling loyal populations on confiscated ground, the legal maneuvers for declaring land vacant or forfeit. All of it was rehearsed in Ireland before it was applied anywhere else, and a striking number of the men involved in early English ventures in the Americas had served in Ireland first. The consequences in Ireland itself ran for 400 years and are not finished. Then came the Elizabethans, and here we should be careful, because this is the part that has been most thoroughly romanticized. Under Elizabeth I, English seamen began operating in the Atlantic in a manner that sat somewhere between commerce, piracy, and undeclared war. John Hawkins made voyages in the 1560s carrying enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies in defiance of Spanish monopoly, which is where English involvement in the slave trade begins. Francis Drake raided Spanish shipping and Spanish ports and circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, returning with plunder that produced an extraordinary return for his investors, the Queen among them. These men are traditionally described as sea dogs, which is a very effective way of not saying privateer, which is itself a very effective way of not saying pirate with a license. The first attempts at actual settlement failed. An expedition sponsored by Walter Raleigh established a colony at Roanoke, off what is now North Carolina, in the 1580s. The first group came home. A second group, including women and children, was left there in 1587, and when a relief ship finally reached the site in 1590, delayed by war with Spain, the settlement was empty. The people were gone. What became of them has never been established, and the most likely explanation that survivors were absorbed into neighboring indigenous communities is also the least dramatic and therefore the least repeated. The lesson England took from Roanoke was that this could not be done by a nobleman with a patent and some enthusiasm. It needed capital, and it needed an organization that could absorb losses over years. The answer was the joint stock company. The idea is simple, and it changed the world. Rather than one merchant risking everything on one voyage, many investors buy shares in a company. The company runs the venture, and profits and losses are divided among the shareholders in proportion to what they put in. Risk is spread. Failure does not ruin an individual, and capital can be raised on a scale no single person commands. On the last day of the year 1600, Elizabeth granted a charter to a group of London merchants, incorporating them as the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. The East India Company. It was given a monopoly of English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. It was, in the beginning, a modest trading concern, and it went east, not to conquer anything, but to buy pepper and spices, and it was for a long time considerably less successful than its Dutch equivalent, which was better capitalized and more ruthless. Nobody at that meeting was founding an empire. They were trying to break into a spice market. 7 years later, on the other side of the world, another company tried again in America. In 1607, the Virginia Company landed about 100 men at a marshy site on a river in the Chesapeake and called it Jamestown. It was very nearly a disaster. The site was low, brackish, and malarial. The settlers included too many gentlemen unwilling to dig and too few farmers. They arrived in a drought. Relations with the Powhatan Confederacy, whose land it was and who initially traded food with them, deteriorated into violence. In the winter of 1609 into 1610, the colony experienced what became known as the starving time, and the great majority died. The survivors abandoned the site and were turned back downriver by an arriving relief fleet. What saved Virginia was a plant. Tobacco had been introduced to Europe from the Americas in the previous century, and there was already a considerable market for it. A settler named John Rolfe experimented with a sweeter Caribbean variety and found it grew well in Virginia soil. By the 1620s, tobacco was the colony's reason for existing. Tobacco is a demanding crop and it exhausts the land, which meant a constant appetite for more ground, which meant constant pressure on indigenous land, which meant war. And it required labor. At first, that labor was indentured. Poor English men and women signed contracts binding them to work for a term of years, typically 4 to 7, in exchange for passage and eventual freedom and sometimes land. Many died before the term expired. It was brutal, and it was temporary, and it was not slavery. In 1619, a ship put in at Point Comfort in Virginia and sold about 20 enslaved Africans taken from a Portuguese vessel. Their legal status in the colony's first years is genuinely ambiguous in the surviving records, and some appear to have gained freedom. But over the following decades, colonial legislatures did something deliberate. In a series of statutes across the later 17th century, they defined slavery as lifelong, made it hereditary through the mother, tied it explicitly to African descent, and closed the roots out of it. That was not an inheritance from anywhere. It was written, clause by clause, by colonial assemblies of Englishmen who understood perfectly well what they were building. Meanwhile, further north, a different kind of colony was taking shape. In 1620, a group of religious separatists, later called the Pilgrims, landed at Cape Cod. Larger Puritan migrations followed through the 1630s into Massachusetts Bay. These people were not primarily after profit. They were after the freedom to build a society ordered according to their own reading of Scripture, having found England insufficiently reformed. The society they built was disciplined, literate, town-centered, and unusually equal by the standards of the time among its own members, and it was also intensely intolerant of dissent within itself, which is why offshoots kept splitting away to found Rhode Island and Connecticut. Their relationship with the indigenous peoples of New England followed a grim arc. Early cooperation encouraged on the native side by the catastrophic epidemics that had swept the coast just before the English arrived, killing an enormous proportion of the coastal population and leaving cleared fields the settlers took as providence. Then land pressure. Then war. I want to say something plain here and then move on because we will meet this pattern many times tonight, and I do not want to keep re-explaining it. Across the Americas and later across Australia and the Pacific, the single greatest killer of indigenous populations was disease. Smallpox above all, and measles, influenza, and others, arriving among populations with no prior exposure. The mortality figures are almost beyond comprehension, often reaching 70, 80, 90% of a community within a generation or two. Most of that was not deliberate. Nobody in 1620 had a theory of immunity. But it is also not the whole story, because dispossession, warfare, forced relocation, and the destruction of food systems all did their own work alongside the epidemics, and those were policy. And there are documented instances later of deliberate use of infection. Both facts are real. The microbes did most of the killing, and the taking of land was intentional. Neither cancels the other. By the middle of the 17th century, then, England had a scatter of Atlantic colonies, Virginia and Maryland growing tobacco, New England fishing, trading, and farming, a foothold at Newfoundland, and most valuable of all by a very long way, a set of small islands. We have to slow down here, because we have arrived at the engine, and it is not the part of the story that gets the paintings. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the most profitable British possessions on earth were not in North America and were nowhere near India. They were a handful of Caribbean islands, some of them small enough to walk across in a day. Barbados was settled from 1627. It began, like Virginia, with small farms growing tobacco and cotton with indentured English labor, and it was not doing especially well. Then, in the 1640s, sugar arrived, brought by planters with knowledge from the Dutch and from Brazil, where the Portuguese had been running sugar plantations with enslaved labor for a century. Sugar changed everything because sugar is not really an agricultural crop. It is an industrial process that begins in a field. Cane must be cut when ripe and crushed within a day or two, or the juice spoils. So the mill must be beside the field. The juice must then be boiled down through a series of enormous copper kettles, skimmed and transferred from one to the next until it reaches the exact point where it will crystallize. And that judgment has to be made by eye, in a boiling house, in the heat of the Caribbean, beside open furnaces that burn day and night through the harvest. It is dangerous work, performed at speed under a merciless schedule, and it demands a large, concentrated, unfree workforce that can be driven at the pace the process requires. The result was that the small farms of Barbados were bought up and consolidated into large plantations within a generation, and the labor force was replaced. And so we come to the slave trade, and I am going to set out the shape of it clearly and without dwelling on the horrors, because you are trying to sleep, and because the numbers themselves say what needs saying. The transatlantic slave trade, across its whole span from the early 16th century to the 1860s and across all the European nations involved, embarked roughly 12.5 million Africans. Around 10.5 to 10.7 million survived the crossing. The difference, well over 1.5 million died at sea. Of that total, British colonial ships carried something in the region of 3.25 to 3.5 million people. Portugal carried more. Britain was the second largest carrier overall. And for much of the 18th century, it was the largest active one, and it was the most efficient. The trade was often described as triangular, and the description is roughly right. Manufactured goods out from Bristol, Liverpool, and London to the West African coast, textiles, metalware, firearms, alcohol, captives from the coast to the Americas, sugar, tobacco, and later cotton back to Britain. Two things need saying about the African end of it because they are both true. And people usually want only one. Slavery existed in West Africa before Europeans arrived, and African states and merchants were active participants in the trade, capturing and selling people to European buyers at the coast and profiting enormously. European traders very rarely went inland, they bought at the shore. And the scale of European demand transformed what it met. The volume required was so far beyond anything previous that it reorganized the politics of a large part of a continent, incentivized raiding and warfare, armed the states that participated most heavily, and drew captives from ever deeper inland. Both statements are documented. Neither is a defense of the other. Defense. The economic effect on Britain was enormous, and it is worth being specific because the general claim gets waved at without content. Liverpool grew from a modest port into a major city substantially on this trade. Bristol and Glasgow grew with it. The profits fed into banking, insurance, and shipping, and marine insurance in particular developed partly to cover these voyages. Country houses were built with it. Colleges and hospitals and civic institutions were endowed by men whose money came from it, and in recent years, a great deal of careful archival work has traced exactly whose. Historians argue about how central it was to British industrialization. The strong version that the slave economy financed the Industrial Revolution has been contested for decades on the grounds that the sums, while large, were not large enough relative to the whole British economy. The more moderate version, which has held up better, is that the Atlantic system provided crucial markets, crucial raw materials, and crucial capital at crucial moments, and that Lancashire cotton in particular is unintelligible without it. That argument is live, and you will find serious historians on both sides. What is not in dispute is the human accounting on the islands. Conditions on Caribbean sugar plantations were so severe that the enslaved population did not reproduce itself. Deaths exceeded births year after year for over a century, and the population was maintained only by continuous new arrivals. That is not an incidental fact. It is a measurement of how the system worked, and planters made the calculation explicitly, judging it cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to keep them alive. Resistance was constant. It ran from everyday sabotage and feigned illness through to escape and to open revolt. Communities of escaped people, called Maroons, established themselves in the mountainous interiors of Jamaica and elsewhere and fought the British to a negotiated settlement in the 1730s. There were major risings in Jamaica in 1760 and 1831, and in Barbados in 1816, and in Demerara in 1823, and many more. And in 1791, in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, an enslaved population rose, defeated in turn French, Spanish, and British armies, and established the independent state of Haiti. The British expedition sent to take the island lost tens of thousands of men, mostly to disease, and achieved nothing. That revolution terrified every slaveholding power in the Atlantic, and it changed the politics of abolition permanently. And we will come back to it. Let us step back to the shape of the thing for a moment. In 1707, the Acts of Union joined the kingdoms of England and Scotland into Great Britain. Strictly speaking, there is no British Empire before that date, only an English one with Scottish participation. Scotland brought a great deal. Scots were spectacularly overrepresented in the empire's administration, army, medical services, and trading houses, well beyond their share of the population for reasons that include a strong educational system and limited opportunity at home. A very great deal of what the world encountered as English was in practice Scottish. The 18th century then became a long contest with France, fought across every ocean, in a series of wars that people sometimes call a Second 100 Years' War. The decisive one was the 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, and it is a reasonable claim that it was the first genuinely global war. It was fought in Europe, in North America, in the Caribbean, in West Africa, in India, and at sea in between. Britain won it comprehensively. In North America in 1759, a British force under James Wolfe took Quebec after landing at night below the cliffs, and French Canada fell. In India, the company's forces under Robert Clive took the French out of the contest for influence in Bengal and the South. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 gave Britain Canada, Florida, and a dominant position in India, and left France with a fraction of what it had held. Britain was now, unambiguously, the leading imperial power in the world. It was also very deeply in debt, and what it did about that debt would cost it a great deal. Before we get there, we need to look at what happened in Bengal, because it is the strangest transformation in the whole of this story. The East India Company had spent a century and a half as a trading concern with fortified warehouses on the coast, called factories, at Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. It paid for the privilege of trading there. It answered to Indian rulers. It was, in the framework of the Mughal Empire, a licensed merchant, and a fairly minor one. India at that point was not a poor country waiting to be developed. It was one of the great manufacturing economies of the world. Estimates of India's share of global manufacturing output in the early 18th century commonly run around a quarter, and Indian cotton textiles were the finest and most sought after in the world. So successful in Britain that Parliament passed laws restricting their import to protect domestic weavers. What changed was not that Britain grew strong. It was that the Mughal Empire came apart. Mughal authority had covered most of the subcontinent under Aurangzeb, who died in 1707. What followed was decades of succession struggle, the rise of successor states that were nominally Mughal and practically independent, the expansion of Maratha power from the west, and in 1739 a devastating invasion from Persia under Nader Shah, who sacked Delhi and took the treasury with him. By the middle of the century, India was a system of competing states with sophisticated armies, ambitious rulers, and a constant appetite for allies, money, and modern artillery. Into that, a foreign trading company with disciplined infantry and access to European credit could insert itself as a player. And it did. In 1757, at Plassey in Bengal, Robert Clive's force met the army of the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and won. Plassey is often described as a battle. It is more accurately described as the completion of a conspiracy. Clive had already reached an arrangement with the Nawab's commander Mir Jafar and with Bengali banking interests who had lost confidence in the young ruler. A large part of the Nawab's army did not engage. Mir Jafar took the throne, and the company took the credit and the payments, and Clive personally received a fortune. 7 years later at Buxar, a more serious battle against a combined force settled the question militarily. And in 1765, the Mughal emperor, by then a figurehead, granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, the right to collect the land revenue of the richest province in India. Stop and look at what that means, because it is genuinely bizarre. A private commercial company, registered in London, answerable to its shareholders, with its own army, had acquired the taxation rights over perhaps 20 to 30 million people, and it now had an income stream in India with which to buy Indian goods to sell in Britain. The company was no longer bringing silver to India to buy textiles. It was taxing Bengalis and using their money to buy Bengali goods. The immediate results were catastrophic. Revenue demands were pushed hard, the traditional flexibility of collection in bad years was abandoned, and when the rains failed in 1769, Bengal suffered a famine in 1770 in which contemporary estimates suggested something approaching a third of the population died. Modern historians treat the specific figures cautiously. The population baseline is not securely known, but agree the mortality was appalling and that company revenue policy made a drought into a catastrophe. Back in Britain, the reaction was not simple approval. There was genuine unease, partly moral and partly self-interested, about company servants returning home with vast unexplained fortunes, buying estates and parliamentary seats. They were called nabobs, from the Indian word nawab, and they were widely resented as a new kind of corrupt wealth. Parliament began legislating. The Regulating Act of 1773 and Pitt's India Act of 1784 progressively subordinated the company to government oversight, and in 1788 the impeachment of Warren Hastings, the former Governor-General, opened in Westminster and ran for 7 years, with Edmund Burke prosecuting in speeches of enormous power, arguing that the British in India were bound by a universal moral law, and that oppression in Calcutta was oppression regardless of distance. Hastings was acquitted. The trial mattered anyway because it established, publicly and at length, that what happened out there was a legitimate subject of argument at home. That is a pattern worth holding on to. From this point onward, essentially every serious imperial atrocity produced a British opposition to it, sometimes small, sometimes enormous, and the empire's critics were very often British. Now back to that debt. Britain had won the 7 Years' War and had an enormous bill to show for it, along with a much larger North American territory to defend. The government took the entirely reasonable sounding view that the colonists who had benefited most directly should contribute to the cost. So Parliament legislated a stamp duty in 1765, duties on imported goods, measures to enforce collection. The colonial response was not primarily about the amounts, which were modest. It was about the principle. The colonies had their own elected assemblies, which had voted their own taxes for generations. A parliament in which they had no members was now taxing them directly. The phrase that crystallized it, no taxation without representation, was a constitutional argument, and it was made in the vocabulary of English liberty by people who considered themselves Englishmen being denied their birthright. It escalated, as these things do, through boycotts, riots, troops, a shooting in Boston, tea thrown into a harbor, punitive legislation, and finally, in 1775, shooting at Lexington and Concord. The war ran for 8 years. The colonists had the enormous advantages of distance, terrain, and a population that mostly wanted them to win. From 1778, they also had France, which entered the war for the pleasure of avenging 1763, followed by Spain and the Dutch. The Royal Navy for once faced a coalition it could not simply outmatch, and in 1781 a French fleet held off the British at the mouth of the Chesapeake long enough for a British army under Cornwallis to be trapped at Yorktown and forced to surrender. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the independence of the United States. Britain had lost the most populous, most prosperous, most culturally connected part of its empire, and a good many people in London believed the empire was finished. It was not. Within a century, it would be 4 times larger. And here is the part that most upends expectations. Trade between Britain and the United States. After independence grew, the Americans went on buying British manufactures and selling raw materials, and the commercial relationship flourished without the cost of governing anybody. That lesson was noticed, and it fed directly into the argument, powerful in Britain through the middle of the 19th century, that formal empire was frequently a waste of money, and that what you actually wanted was trade. Historians often mark 1783 as the end of the First British Empire and the beginning of the Second. The first was Atlantic, based on settlement, sugar, and slavery. The second was global, centered on India, driven by trade and by naval supremacy, and increasingly justified by a language of improvement and duty. The transition was already underway while the American War was being lost. Between 1768 and 1779, James Cook made 3 voyages into the Pacific. Cook is worth pausing on because he is a genuinely remarkable figure, and because what followed him is very hard. He was the son of a Yorkshire farm laborer who went to sea in the coal trade and rose entirely on competence, which was close to impossible in the Georgian Navy. He was an exceptional navigator and chart maker, and his charts of the New Zealand coast were still in use well over a century later. He took unusual care over his crew's health and lost remarkably few men to scurvy. His first voyage carried astronomers to Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus across the sun, part of an international scientific effort to measure the distance from the Earth to the sun, which is a genuinely beautiful thing for a naval expedition to have been doing. He charted the east coast of Australia in 1770 and claimed it for the British Crown, and mapped New Zealand and crossed the Antarctic Circle and was killed in Hawaii in 1779 in a confrontation that began over a stolen boat. For Pacific peoples, his voyages are the beginning of a catastrophe, disease, dispossession, and the arrival of a power that would not leave. Both of those things are what he was. The claim to Australia rested on a legal idea that would do enormous damage. The land was treated as terra nullius, nobody's land, on the reasoning that the peoples living there did not farm it in a recognizably European way and therefore did not own it. Aboriginal peoples had lived on that continent for something on the order of 60,000 years, managing land with fire, with intricate systems of law and custodianship attached to specific country. That doctrine was not overturned in Australian law until 1992. The first use Britain made of the claim was as a prison. Convicts had been transported to America for decades, and independence closed that outlet. In 1788, the first fleet landed about 1,000 people, most of them convicts, at Port Jackson. Over the following 80 years, around 160,000 convicts were transported to Australia, most for property crimes, many for offenses that were the ordinary consequence of poverty. The colonies that grew from that became, within a lifetime, prosperous settler societies, built on wool and later gold, self-governing from the 1850s, and among the most loyal parts of the empire. For Aboriginal Australians, the same period was dispossession, epidemic disease, frontier violence that in some districts amounted to massacre, and the removal of children from families, a policy that continued into the 1970s. Now let us turn to abolition, which is the part of this story the British have been proudest of for 2 centuries, and which is more complicated and more interesting than either the triumphant version or the cynical one. At the start of the 1780s, Britain was the largest slave-trading nation on earth, and the trade was uncontroversial among most of the political class. Within 25 years, Parliament had abolished it. Within 50, slavery itself was abolished across the empire. That is a genuinely astonishing reversal, and it needs explaining rather than either celebrating or dismissing. The campaign that produced it invented much of what we now recognize as political activism. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in 1787 largely by Quakers, along with Anglicans including Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp. Clarkson traveled the country for years, gathering evidence, interviewing sailors, collecting shackles and branding irons and thumbscrews to show at meetings, documenting mortality on the ships from the crew's own testimony, including the mortality among the British sailors, which was itself horrifying and which made the trade look bad even to people indifferent to Africans. They commissioned a diagram of a slave ship, the Brooks, showing the human cargo packed into the hold as legally permitted. It was printed by the thousand and put on walls. It is probably the most effective piece of political graphic design ever produced. They organized a mass petition campaign, gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures, including from people who had no vote and for whom a petition was the only political act available. They ran a consumer boycott of West Indian sugar, in which perhaps 300,000 households participated, and which was organized substantially by women who were excluded from formal politics entirely. William Wilberforce carried the parliamentary side of it, introducing bill after bill and losing year after year for the better part of 2 decades, and the most important voices were those of formerly enslaved people themselves. Olaudah Equiano's autobiography, published in 1789, was a bestseller and went through many editions, and he toured the country promoting it. Ottobah Cugoano published a direct and uncompromising attack on slavery in 1787. There was a black community in London that organized and lobbied. Alongside all of that ran resistance in the colonies, which mattered more than the traditional British telling allows. The Haitian Revolution demonstrated that slave societies could be destroyed from within. The major risings in Barbados in 1816, Demerara in 1823, and Jamaica in 1831 and 1832 made the same point closer to home, and the savagery of the reprisals against the last of them, widely reported in Britain, damaged the planters' case badly, at exactly the wrong moment for them. The trade was abolished in 1807, effective from May of that year. Slavery itself in most of the British Empire was abolished by an act of 1833, taking effect in 1834. Now the parts that get left out. Emancipation was not immediate. The formerly enslaved were placed in a system called apprenticeship, obliging them to continue working largely uncompensated for their former owners for a further period. It was so unpopular and so obviously a continuation of the thing supposedly ended that it collapsed early in 1838. And the act provided compensation, 20 million pounds of it, an enormous sum, somewhere around 40% of annual government expenditure at the time, raised by loan. It was paid to the slave owners. Not one penny went to any enslaved person. The compensation was for loss of property, and the property was people, and the state paid the owners for it. Records of every claim survive, and a research project at University College London has made them public, and the list of beneficiaries includes a great many prominent families, institutions, and fortunes whose descendants had no idea. The loan raised to pay, it was not finally paid off by the British Treasury until 2015. After abolition, Britain committed to suppressing the trade internationally. The West Africa Squadron of the Royal Navy patrolled for decades, intercepted something like 1,600 ships, and freed on the order of 150,000 people at considerable cost in money and in sailors' lives, mostly to disease. Britain also pressed other nations to abolish, through treaties, through diplomatic pressure, and through payments. So how do we hold all this? The cynical reading says, abolition happened because slavery had become less profitable, and Britain moved to a wage labor model that suited it better. That reading has been examined closely and does not survive contact with the evidence very well. The British Caribbean was still highly profitable in the 1830s, and Britain gave up a lucrative trade to competitors and then spent enormous sums for decades suppressing it. The triumphant reading says Britain led the world in ending slavery, which is true, and tends not to mention that it had led the world in conducting it, that it paid the owners and not the owned, and that emancipation in the empire coincided with a great expansion of other forms of coerced labor. That last point deserves its own moment. After 1834, plantation owners across the empire needed labor and found it in the system of indenture. Between the 1830s and the 1920s, well over 1 million people, mostly from India and also from China, were recruited on contracts of typically 5 years and shipped to Mauritius, to Trinidad, to British Guiana, to Fiji, to Natal, to Malaya. Conditions varied from tolerable to appalling. Recruitment involved a great deal of deception. Mortality on some voyages and estates was very high. Contemporaries called it a new system of slavery, and while the comparison is not exact since indenture was time-limited and nominally voluntary, it was coerced labor serving the same plantations. That migration is why there are large communities of Indian descent today in Fiji, Trinidad, Guyana, Mauritius, and South Africa. It is one of the largest population movements of the 19th century, and most people have never heard of it. Now, the middle of the 19th century, and the period sometimes called the Pax Britannica, for roughly 100 years after 1815, when the Napoleonic Wars ended, Britain was the dominant power in the world in a way no state had been before. The foundation was the Royal Navy. After Trafalgar in 1805 and the final defeat of France in 1815, there was simply no serious naval rival, and Britain used that to police the oceans, suppress piracy, chart coastlines, and guarantee the sea lanes on which its trade ran. That deserves a little more than a sentence, because the Navy is the thing that made all the rest of it possible. And it is usually reduced to a painting of Nelson. Trafalgar fought off the Spanish coast in October 1805, destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets, and ended any prospect of an invasion of Britain. Nelson was killed in it at the moment of the victory, which is precisely the kind of ending that guarantees a man 3 centuries of statues. What that victory bought was a century in which no other power could seriously contest the sea, and Britain spent it building an infrastructure of naval bases and coaling stations around the world. Gibraltar, Malta, the Cape, Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong, Bermuda, the Falklands, Ascension. Look at a list of Britain's outer possessions, and you are largely looking at a map of where a ship needed to refuel. Later, in 1889, Parliament formalized the ambition as the two-power standard. The Royal Navy was to be maintained at a strength at least equal to the next 2 largest navies combined. The lives inside all this were hard. For much of the period, the Navy could not man its ships by volunteers alone, and it made up the difference by impressment. Press gangs took men off merchant ships and out of coastal towns, and the practice was legal, deeply hated, and central to how the fleet was crewed during the Great Wars. Life aboard was cramped, wet, poorly fed, and disciplined with the lash. Disease killed far more sailors than enemy action, and in tropical stations it killed appalling proportions of a crew. The introduction of citrus juice as a standard issue against scurvy from the 1790s was one of the genuine advances, and it is roughly why British sailors acquired a nickname that stuck. None of that is grand, but it is the actual mechanism. Behind every treaty and every governor and every cargo of tea there was a ship, and on the ship there were several hundred people living in conditions that most of us would find unendurable, and a great many of them did not come home. The second foundation was industry. Britain industrialized first, and for several decades produced a share of the world's manufactured goods entirely out of proportion to its population. Cotton textiles, above all, from Lancashire, exported everywhere. The third was finance. The City of London became the world's clearinghouse. British capital was invested across the globe in railways in Argentina and Canada and India, in mines and ports and government bonds. And the ideology that went with all this was free trade. The argument was that Britain, being the most efficient producer, benefited most from open markets, and that formal empire was expensive and often unnecessary. Why govern a country when you can simply sell to it? The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 was the great domestic victory of that view. Historians call the result informal empire. Places that were not colored red on the map, but where British commercial and diplomatic power was decisive. much of Latin America, parts of the Ottoman world, and China, which brings us to the Opium Wars. And there is no way to tell this one that reflects any credit at all. Britain wanted Chinese tea in enormous and growing quantities. China, under the Qing, wanted very little that Britain produced and required payment in silver. The resulting trade deficit was severe. The solution found was opium grown in British India, shipped to the Chinese coast, and sold through intermediaries in defiance of Chinese law, which prohibited it. The trade grew until it reversed the flow of silver and produced a serious addiction problem in southern China. In 1839, a Chinese imperial commissioner, Lin Zexu, seized and destroyed over 1,000 tons of opium at Canton. Britain went to war over it. The First Opium War ran from 1839 to 1842, and China, whose forces were badly outmatched by steam warships and modern artillery, lost. The Treaty of Nanking opened treaty ports, imposed an indemnity, and ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain. A second war from 1856 to 1860, fought alongside France, ended with the sacking and burning of the Emperor's summer palace outside Beijing, a complex of gardens and buildings of extraordinary beauty, looted comprehensively before it was destroyed. Objects taken from it are in European museums today, and their return is an active diplomatic issue. In China, this whole period is known as the Century of Humiliation, and it remains a live and formative element of Chinese national consciousness, taught in schools, invoked in foreign policy. If you want to understand why certain arguments land the way they do in Beijing today, this is where a great deal of it starts. It was also opposed in Britain at the time. Gladstone, then a young MP, denounced the First War in the Commons in terms as harsh as anything a modern critic could write, saying he did not know of a war more unjust in its origin or more calculated to cover the country with disgrace. The government won the vote by 9. Now let me turn to a completely different part of the empire, which developed in the opposite direction at exactly the same time, and which most tellings leave out because it is undramatic. The settler colonies. Britain had lost 13 North American colonies by insisting on governing them from London. It spent the following century working out how not to do that again. And the answer it arrived at was to let them go without letting them leave. In 1837, there were rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada, small ones, easily suppressed. The government sent out Lord Durham to find out what had gone wrong. His report, published in 1839, recommended something close to what the American colonists had wanted, that the colonial government should be answerable to the colonial legislature rather than to the governor. They called it responsible government, and by the late 1840s, it was operating in Nova Scotia and in Canada, and it spread from there. The results were quietly extraordinary. In 1867, the British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada, a self-governing federation under the Crown. Australia federated in 1901. New Zealand became a dominion in 1907, and South Africa a union in 1910. These were, in practice, independent countries by the early 20th century, running their own affairs, setting their own tariffs, and in due course conducting their own foreign policy while remaining formally within the empire and genuinely attached to it. That is a real political achievement, and it is why the empire did not produce a second American Revolution. But look closely at who received it, because the pattern is not subtle. Responsible government was granted to colonies with substantial populations of European settlers. It was not granted to India, to Nigeria, to Jamaica, to Kenya for another century, or in some cases at all. The stated reasoning shifted over time: readiness, education, stability. But the correlation with the settler's complexion is not something that requires much interpretation, and the self-governing dominions used their new powers immediately and enthusiastically to legislate against non-white immigration and to dispossess the indigenous peoples already there, frequently going further than London would have preferred. New Zealand is the clearest illustration. In 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed between the Crown and a large number of Maori chiefs. It exists in two versions, one in English and one in Maori, and they do not say the same thing. The English text has the chiefs ceding sovereignty. The Maori text uses a word that conveys something closer to governorship, while guaranteeing the chiefs what the Maori text calls rangatiratanga, their own full authority over their lands and treasures. Those are not compatible documents, and the difference is not an accident of translation so much as the reason the treaty was signed at all. What followed was land purchase, land confiscation, and a series of wars through the 1840s to the 1870s, and the loss of the great majority of Maori land. The treaty was largely disregarded for over a century, and then, from 1975, revived. A tribunal was established to hear claims of breaches, and it has since produced settlements, apologies, and the return of land and assets. The treaty is now central to New Zealand's constitutional life, which is a genuinely unusual afterlife for a document that was ignored for 4 generations. Back to India, where the company was still extraordinarily in charge. Across the first half of the 19th century, company territory expanded steadily by conquest and by a set of legal devices, of which the most resented was the doctrine of lapse, the rule that if an Indian ruler died without a natural heir, his state passed to the company, regardless of the long-established Indian practice of adoption. Alongside conquest came a change of attitude, and it matters. The early company men in India had often been enthusiasts for the place. They learned Persian and Sanskrit, married Indian women, collected manuscripts, and founded the Asiatic Society, which did serious work in linguistics and archaeology, including the discovery that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin were related, which founded the whole study of Indo-European languages. By the 1830s, that generation had been displaced by a different one, evangelical, reforming, confident that British civilization was simply superior and that its job was to remake India in its image. Thomas Babington Macaulay's Education Minute of 1835, which dismissed the entire literature of India and Arabia as worth less than a single shelf of a good European library, is the notorious statement of that view, and it set English as the language of higher education in India. Reforms followed, some of them genuinely humane by any standard, including the outlawing of sati, the burning of widows, in 1829, which was campaigned for by Indian reformers, most prominently Ram Mohan Roy, as well as by the British. But the accumulated effect was a growing sense among many Indians that everything they were was under attack. In 1857, that broke. It began among the sepoys, the Indian soldiers, who made up the overwhelming bulk of the company's armies, and the immediate trigger was a rumor about cartridges for a new rifle, whose paper cartridges had to be bitten open and were said to be greased with beef and pork fat, offensive to Hindu and Muslim soldiers respectively. Whether the rumor was accurate hardly mattered. It was believed, and it was believed because it fitted everything else people already thought. The rising spread from Meerut to Delhi, where the last Mughal emperor, an elderly poet living on a company pension, was proclaimed the figurehead of the revolt. It spread across much of northern India joined by dispossessed rulers, landholders, and peasants with their own grievances. It was extremely violent on both sides. British civilians, including women and children, were killed at Kanpur. British reprisals were systematic, prolonged, and in places indiscriminate, with villages burned and large numbers executed, sometimes by being blown from cannon. The company won with the help of Indian troops who stayed loyal, particularly from the Punjab, and with the vast advantage of the telegraph, which moved information faster than the rebels could move armies. What the British called the mutiny and what a great many Indians call the First War of Independence changed everything. In 1858, the East India Company was abolished. Its territories passed directly to the Crown. In 1876, Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India, and the character of British rule hardened. The confident reforming impulse gave way to caution, distance, and racial separation. British officials and their families lived apart in cantonments and hill stations. The army was reorganized with a much higher proportion of British troops, and Indian units organized along lines of caste and region, on the deliberate principle of avoiding a unified Indian force. The theory of martial races, which held that certain communities were naturally suited to soldiering, was developed and applied to recruitment, yet at the same time the machinery of a modern state was being built. By 1900, India had one of the largest railway networks in the world, tens of thousands of miles of it. It had a telegraph system, a postal service handling hundreds of millions of items, an irrigation network in the Punjab that turned dry land into some of the most productive farmland in Asia, a codified legal system, universities in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, founded in 1857, and a civil service recruited by competitive examination, which was open to Indians in principle from 1853, though the examination was held in London, which in practice kept the numbers tiny for decades. Both of those pictures are accurate, and this is where the empire's central argument really lives. So let me set it out honestly. The case for the defense, the railways, the canals, the courts, the universities, the unification of a subcontinent under a single administration, the codified law, the ending of certain practices, and the creation of the institutions and the educated class that would eventually run an independent India. The case for the prosecution: the railways were built with Indian capital, raised on guaranteed returns paid by Indian taxpayers, laid out to serve export and military needs rather than internal development, and used to move raw cotton out and finished cloth in. The Indian textile industry, the finest in the world in 1700, was substantially destroyed, partly by British tariffs, partly by mechanized Lancashire competition. India's share of world manufacturing fell dramatically across the period of British rule. Indian taxes paid for the Indian Army, which was used repeatedly for British purposes far outside India. And the famines are the hardest fact of all. There were repeated catastrophic famines in British India in 1770, in the 1870s, in the late 1890s, and in 1943. Aggregate death tolls across the whole period run into many millions, and estimates vary enormously depending on method. The great famines of 1876 to 1878 and 1896 to 1902 coincided with severe El Niño droughts, and that is genuinely part of the explanation, but they also coincided with rigid free market doctrine in relief policy, with continued grain exports from famine districts, with an official reluctance to interfere with markets, and in the 1870s with a viceroy who feared that generous relief would create dependency. Some officials, including notably a few provincial administrators, disobeyed and saved lives and were criticized for it. The historian's argument, at its sharpest, is not that Britain caused the droughts. It is that a state with railways, telegraphs, and a surplus in other provinces had the capacity to prevent mass death and chose policies that did not. Others respond that Indian states without British rule had suffered devastating famines too, that relief capacity was genuinely limited, and that the later British Indian famine codes did improve responses. I am not going to hand you a verdict on that. It is a live argument among serious people. What I will say is that the strongest version of the defense and the strongest version of the prosecution are both about the same railways. Let me put you on the ground for a while. It is 1885. Let us look at three people in the same empire on the same day. The first is a woman in Lancashire, in a cotton town, in a terraced house, in a street of identical terraced houses. She was up before 6. She works in a spinning mill, and the noise inside it is beyond anything you have experienced. Hundreds of machines running, so loud that the workers have developed a way of speaking by lip movement alone. The air is deliberately kept hot and damp so the thread does not break, and it is thick with cotton dust, and the dust is doing something to her lungs that will shorten her life. The raw cotton she is spinning was grown in Egypt, in India, or in the American South. The cloth she is making will be sold in Bombay and Lagos and Buenos Aires. Her wage is low, her hours are long, her town is filthy, and her life expectancy is worse than that of a farm laborer in the countryside. She has, in one sense, benefited from the empire. Her job exists because of it. Sugar and tea, once luxuries, are on her table daily. She has no vote. She owns nothing. Nobody has ever asked her opinion about anything. The second is a cultivator in Bengal, in a village of mud and thatch, up before dawn, working land he does not own, under a tenancy arrangement created by a British revenue settlement made 90 years earlier, which fixed the rights of landlords and left tenants exposed. He pays rent in cash, which means he must sell his crop at harvest when prices are lowest, which means he borrows from a moneylender against next year's crop, and the interest is such that the debt is effectively permanent. It will pass to his son. There is a railway 10 miles away, and it does move grain, and in a good year that raises the price he gets. In a bad year it moves grain out of his district to somewhere that can pay more. There is a court in the district town that applies a written law equally in principle. He can use it, and people like him sometimes do and sometimes win, but it costs money and requires literacy and lawyers. The third is a young man from Aberdeenshire, 24 years old. 3 months into a posting as an assistant magistrate in a district in the same province, he passed a fiercely competitive examination in London. He is responsible, with a handful of colleagues, for a district of perhaps 1 million people. He is learning Bengali badly. He rides out on tour for weeks at a time, hearing cases under a tree, settling boundary disputes, inspecting granaries. He is, in his own understanding, a good man doing a difficult job in a hot climate, far from home, at some risk to his health, for a modest salary. He may well be right about that. He is also the local face of a system that takes revenue out of that district and answers, ultimately, to a parliament in which not one of those 1 million people is represented. None of the three chose this. All three are inside it. That is what an empire is at ground level, not villains and victims arranged neatly, but an enormous number of ordinary people occupying positions in a structure none of them designed. We should turn to Ireland now because it sits inside the United Kingdom and outside it at the same time, and because what happened there in the 1840s is the hardest case of all for the argument that this was a well-meaning enterprise. By the 1840s, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, joined by an Act of Union in 1801 with members at Westminster. It was also, in most practical respects, governed like a colony, much of the land owned by a Protestant landowning class, many of them absentee, and worked by an overwhelmingly Catholic tenantry subdivided into holdings so small that only one crop could feed a family from them. That crop was the potato, and roughly 3 million people depended on it almost entirely. In 1845, a water mold reached Ireland and destroyed the crop. It destroyed it again in 1846, and in 1848 and 1849. Over the following years, around 1 million people died of starvation and of the diseases that follow it, and around another million emigrated, mostly to North America, in conditions on the ships that gave them a name. Ireland's population fell by roughly a quarter, and it has never returned to its pre-famine level, which is a sentence worth reading twice. Now the part that makes it a political question rather than a natural disaster. Throughout the famine, Ireland continued to export food. Grain, cattle, butter, and other produce left Irish ports under guard, while people in the same counties starved. The reason is that the starving had no money, and the produce belonged to landlords who could sell it elsewhere, and the government declined to interfere with the market. Relief was attempted. There were public works schemes and soup kitchens which, at their peak in 1847, fed around 3 million people and which worked, and which were then wound up on the grounds that the crisis had passed and that the cost should fall on Irish landlords rather than the British Treasury. The doctrine behind those decisions was a rigid economic liberalism combined, in a number of senior officials, with an explicitly providential view that the calamity was a divine correction of Irish society, and with a widely expressed contempt for the Irish poor that runs through the correspondence of the period and is not difficult to find. Was it genocide? Some argue so. Most historians do not use that term, on the grounds that intent to destroy is not demonstrated, and instead describe a catastrophic failure of a government that possessed the resources and the information to do far more, and was prevented by ideology, indifference, and prejudice from doing it. Tony Blair issued a statement of regret in 1997, acknowledging that those who governed failed their people. Whatever term is used, it hollowed out a country. It created a diaspora that carried the memory with it, particularly to the United States. And it made Irish independence, when it came in the 20th century, close to inevitable. Before we reach Africa, there is one more force to account for, and it is the one that thought of itself as the opposite of conquest: the missionaries. From the 1790s onward, a wave of evangelical enthusiasm in Britain produced missionary societies in numbers, sending people out across the world to convert, to teach, and to heal. They went to India, to the Pacific, to the Caribbean, and above all, to Africa. Their relationship with the rest of the empire was genuinely complicated, and it is worth getting right. Missionaries were frequently a nuisance to traders and settlers, and were resented as such. They reported abuses. In the Caribbean, missionaries were among the most effective witnesses against slavery, and one of them was tried and died in prison in Demerara after a rising there, which caused an enormous scandal in Britain. In Africa, missionary reporting was central to exposing the atrocities in the Belgian Congo. They also unavoidably attacked the cultures they entered: languages, rituals, forms of marriage, forms of dress, and systems of belief that had held communities together for centuries were treated as darkness to be cleared. A great deal was lost that nobody recorded. And they built schools, which is the part with the longest tail. Mission schools educated a very large proportion of the people who would eventually lead independence movements across Africa and Asia. They taught literacy, English, and without meaning to, the political vocabulary of rights and equality and the moral force of the argument that all souls are equal. That vocabulary was then turned back on the empire with considerable effect. The most famous of them was David Livingstone, a Scottish mill worker's son who taught himself Latin at a spinning machine, qualified as a doctor, and spent 30 years crossing Central and Southern Africa. He is remembered for a phrase he did not say and a meeting that did not matter, when the journalist Henry Morton Stanley found him in 1871 after he had been out of contact for years. What actually mattered was his campaigning. Livingstone had seen the East African slave trade at first hand, and his reports of it were a major reason for British pressure to suppress it. He died in 1873 in what is now Zambia. His African companions, Chuma and Susi, preserved his body and carried it, with his papers, roughly 1,000 miles to the coast so that it could be sent home. They are the part of that story that deserves the statue. At home, all of this was becoming a culture. The Great Exhibition of 1851 in a vast glass house in Hyde Park drew around 6 million visits and displayed the products of the world arranged unmistakably around Britain at the center. Museums filled with objects acquired by every method from purchase to plunder, and the arguments about returning some of them are still going on. There were boys' adventure stories and maps on classroom walls with a quarter of the world in pink, and Empire Day in schools from 1904, and advertisements using colonial imagery to sell soap and cocoa and tea. By the late 19th century, a British child could grow up entirely surrounded by the empire without ever leaving Birmingham and without ever hearing a single one of its subjects speak. Now Africa, here is the fact that startles people. As late as 1870, European powers controlled only about 10% of the African continent, mostly coastal enclaves and the far south. Within about 30 years, they controlled almost all of it. That is an astonishingly fast carve-up of a continent, and the reasons it happened when it did are worth setting out because they are mostly not the reasons people assume. Medicine first, quinine from cinchona bark made it possible for Europeans to survive in malarial regions. West Africa had been called the white man's grave for good reason. With mortality among Europeans, they're running at rates that made sustained occupation impossible. Prophylactic quinine changed that arithmetic. Technology, second. Steamships that could work up rivers, the telegraph. And decisively, the machine gun, which arrived in the 1880s and produced battles that were not battles. At Omdurman in the Sudan in 1898, an Anglo-Egyptian force killed something in the region of 10,000 Sudanese while losing a few dozen of their own. Politics, third, and this is the real driver. Germany unified in 1871 and wanted colonies. France, defeated by Germany, looked for prestige elsewhere. Belgium's king ran a private venture in the Congo of exceptional brutality. And once one power started claiming territory, the others claimed territory to prevent them having it, whether or not it was worth anything. Much of the scramble was strategic paranoia rather than economic calculation. A great many of the territories seized never came close to paying for their own administration. In 1884 and 1885, the powers met in Berlin and agreed rules for the process. No African representatives were present. The conference did not itself carve up the continent, contrary to a common belief, but it established the principle of effective occupation, which turned a scatter of claims into a race. Britain's share came out enormous. Egypt and Sudan, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Uganda, Rhodesia, Nyasaland, Bechuanaland, and more. Egypt is instructive because Britain never intended to take it and never quite admitted that it had. The Suez Canal opened in 1869, cutting the voyage to India by thousands of miles and becoming immediately the most strategically important waterway on earth for a maritime empire. In 1875, the Egyptian ruler, deep in debt, sold his shareholding, and Disraeli bought it for Britain with money borrowed overnight from the Rothschilds. Egyptian debt to European creditors then produced European financial control, which produced a nationalist movement objecting to it, which produced a British military intervention in 1882 to protect the canal and the bondholders. Britain announced the occupation was temporary. It lasted in one form or another until 1956. That is the pattern of informal empire hardening into formal empire, and it happened repeatedly. Debt, control, resistance, troops, and a temporary arrangement that never ends. Southern Africa produced the ugliest war of the era. Gold was discovered on the Witwatersrand in 1886 in the Transvaal, one of two independent republics founded by Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had trekked inland decades earlier to escape British rule. The largest gold deposit in the world, in a state Britain did not control. The Second Boer War ran from 1899 to 1902. Britain expected a short campaign and got 2.5 years, a series of early humiliations, and then a guerrilla war. It could not end. The response to the guerrilla phase was a scorched earth policy. Farms burned, livestock destroyed, and the civilian population, women and children, moved into camps. They were called concentration camps, a term borrowed from a Spanish policy in Cuba, and long before it acquired its later meaning. They were not extermination camps. They were the product of administrative incompetence, inadequate rations, and appalling sanitation, and around 28,000 Boers died in them, the great majority of them children. At least 20,000 black Africans, held in separate camps, also died, and their deaths went largely unrecorded at the time and largely unmentioned for most of a century afterwards. The camps were exposed by a British woman, Emily Hobhouse, who went out, saw them, came back, and published. The government attacked her and then appointed a commission which confirmed everything she had said and produced reforms that cut the death rate sharply. The Boer War also badly damaged Britain's confidence. Recruiting had revealed that an alarming proportion of working-class volunteers were physically unfit for service, which fed directly into domestic debates about public health, nutrition, and eventually into the beginnings of the welfare state. The empire, in this odd and roundabout way, helped produce free school meals. And so we arrive at the top of the mountain. In 1897, Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee filled London with troops from every part of the empire, marching in a procession designed to make its scale visible in a single afternoon. The empire at that moment was at or near its greatest reach, and it was held together by things that are easy to overlook. The telegraph, above all. From the 1860s onward, submarine cables were laid across the oceans, and by the end of the century, a message could reach India from London in minutes rather than months. Britain owned or controlled most of the world's cable network, which was a form of power at least as important as the Navy. The steamship, which made journeys predictable rather than seasonal. Coaling stations scattered across every ocean, which is why Britain held so many otherwise pointless islands. The migration, which was enormous. Something in the region of 20 million people left the British Isles between the early 19th century and the First World War for the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. It is one of the largest voluntary movements of people in history, and it seeded the English language across the planet and a very small number of administrators. The Indian Civil Service, running a population of some 300 million, numbered around 1,000 men. That figure is the single most revealing statistic about the whole enterprise. An empire that size could not possibly be held by force alone, and it was not. It was held by collaboration, by Indian and African and Malay officials, clerks, soldiers, police, landowners, and princes who worked within the system because it served their interests, or because it was the only game available, or because they believed in parts of it, which is also why, when a critical mass of those people stopped cooperating, the whole thing came down remarkably quickly. The First World War is where the machinery began to come apart, though almost nobody saw it at the time because, on the surface, the empire came out of it larger than ever. The imperial contribution to that war was vast. Around 1.25 to 1.5 million Indians served at Ypres and on the Somme, in Mesopotamia, in East Africa, in Gallipoli, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland sent enormous forces relative to their populations and suffered accordingly. Hundreds of thousands of Africans served as soldiers and as carriers, and the carriers died in appalling numbers, largely of disease, and were largely uncommemorated. That failure of commemoration was formally acknowledged and apologized for by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in 2021. At the peace, Britain gained territory, German colonies in Africa and the Pacific, and mandates in the Middle East over the former Ottoman provinces that became Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. The empire had never been bigger. It had also never been weaker, and here is why. It was broke. Britain had gone from being the world's greatest creditor to a substantial debtor, largely to the United States, and it had liquidated overseas investments to pay for the war. The financial supremacy that underpinned everything had passed westward, and the war had been fought and justified in the language of self-determination and the rights of small nations. Millions of colonial subjects had been asked to fight for those principles. Having been asked, they proceeded to apply them, which is not what the people who used the phrases had intended. The dominions made their point almost immediately. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India signed the peace treaties in their own right and joined the League of Nations as members. Australians and New Zealanders came out of Gallipoli with a story about themselves that was national rather than imperial. Canadians came out of Vimy Ridge with the same. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 recognized the dominions as fully autonomous and equal in status to Britain, bound only by a shared crown. In India, the effect was sharper. Wartime cooperation had been given in the expectation of political advancement. What arrived instead, in 1919, was legislation extending emergency wartime powers of detention without trial into peacetime. Protests followed. And on the 13th of April 1919 in Amritsar in the Punjab, a large crowd gathered in an enclosed public garden called the Jallianwala Bagh, in defiance of a ban many of them had not heard about, for a festival day and a political meeting. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer arrived with troops, blocked the main exit, and ordered fire into the crowd without warning. The firing continued for around 10 minutes, until the ammunition was nearly gone. The official inquiry, the Hunter Commission, put the dead at 379 with over 1,000 wounded. The Indian National Congress estimated around 1,000 dead. The true figure is not established. Dyer told the inquiry that he had intended to produce a moral effect throughout the Punjab. He was relieved of command and censured. He was also, on his return to Britain, celebrated in parts of the press and presented with a large sum raised by public subscription, which is a detail that says as much as the massacre. Amritsar is generally regarded as the moment when Indian loyalty to British rule broke among people who had previously believed in reform from within. Gandhi, who had supported recruitment during the war, moved decisively into opposition, and Gandhi is worth pausing on because what he did was genuinely original. He had spent 20 years in South Africa, where he developed his methods, and he returned to India in 1915. What he offered was a form of mass political action that was disciplined, nonviolent, and designed to make cooperation impossible while giving the authorities nothing to shoot at. Non-cooperation, boycott of British cloth, and the spinning wheel as a symbol of self-reliance. And in 1930, the Salt March, a walk of about 240 miles to the coast to make salt from seawater in violation of a British monopoly on salt, an act so small, so obviously harmless, and so precisely chosen that the government could neither ignore it nor punish it without looking absurd. Tens of thousands were arrested. The photographs went around the world. The empire's great strength had been that it made cooperation the rational choice. Gandhi's insight was that this could be reversed, and that an empire dependent on the participation of the governed could be dissolved by the withdrawal of that participation. The Second World War finished it. Again, the imperial contribution was enormous. The Indian Army expanded to around 2.5 million men, all volunteers, the largest volunteer army ever assembled. African forces fought in Burma and East Africa. The Dominions committed everything again, and again there was a famine. In 1943, Bengal suffered a catastrophe in which estimates of the dead range from around 800,000 to over 3 million, with figures around 2 to 3 million most commonly cited. The causes were tangled. A cyclone destroyed part of the crop in 1942. The Japanese occupation of Burma cut off a major source of rice imports. A scorched earth policy in coastal Bengal intended to deny boats and stocks to a possible Japanese invasion destroyed the transport and livelihood of fishing communities. Wartime inflation, hoarding, and provincial governments blocking grain movements between provinces did the rest. The economist Amartya Sen, who saw the famine as a child, later used it as his central case in arguing that famines are typically not caused by an absence of food, but by a collapse in some people's ability to command it. Food was available in Bengal at prices the rural poor could not reach. The role of the British War Cabinet, and of Churchill personally, is genuinely and sharply contested. One body of work, drawing on cabinet records, argues that requests to divert shipping and grain were repeatedly refused, that exports continued into the crisis, and that Churchill's recorded remarks about India show a hostility that shaped decisions. Another body of work argues that shipping losses in the Atlantic were catastrophic at exactly that moment, that the waters concerned were extremely dangerous, that London was being told by officials in India that there was no shortage, and that once the scale became clear, substantial grain was secured and shipped. Both sides are represented by serious historians. What is not disputed is that a famine of this scale occurred in a territory under British administration. in the middle of the 20th century, and that the relief response was late and insufficient. By 1945, Britain had won the war and lost the capacity to hold an empire. It was effectively bankrupt, sustained by American Lend-Lease, which was terminated abruptly at the war's end. It had a new government committed to building a welfare state at home, which cost money that could not simultaneously be spent garrisoning Asia. Its prestige in Asia had been shattered in 1942 by the fall of Singapore, where a British force surrendered to a smaller Japanese one, an event that demonstrated in front of the entire region that British power was not a fact of nature, and the United States, now the dominant power, was in principle opposed to European colonial empires, partly on genuine anti-colonial conviction and partly because open markets suited it. India went first and fastest and worst. The British decision to leave was taken in 1947, and the timetable was then dramatically accelerated. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, brought the date forward to August of that year. The boundary between India and the new state of Pakistan was drawn by a British lawyer, Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India before, working from maps and census returns in about 5 weeks, and the lines were not published until after independence had been formally granted. The result was one of the largest and most violent population movements in human history. Something in the region of 10 to 15 million people crossed the new borders in each direction. Estimates of the dead and the accompanying communal violence range from several 100,000 to 2 million. The causes are argued about fiercely, and the argument is not neutral in South Asia today. British responsibility is variously located in the long-standing practice of governing through religious categories, in separate electorates introduced in 1909, in the failure to plan for transfer, and above all in the speed of the exit and the decision to leave before the boundary was known. Others emphasize the depth of the political deadlock between the Congress and the Muslim League and the violence already underway before any British decision. What is not arguable is that the hurry cost lives. Burma and Ceylon followed in 1948. Palestine was handed to the United Nations the same year, and Britain left amid a conflict whose consequences are on the news tonight. For about a decade after that, British governments told themselves the process could be managed slowly, over generations, with colonies advanced toward self-government at a pace London would choose. That belief was already out of date, and it had been for years because the people who would end the empire had spent decades organizing and had largely done their organizing in London. This is one of the great ironies of the whole story, and it deserves saying clearly. The Indian National Congress, which would eventually lead India to independence, was founded in 1885. And among its founders was a retired British civil servant, Alan Octavian Hume, who conceived of it partly as a safety valve through which educated Indian opinion could be expressed harmlessly. Within a generation it was demanding self-rule, and within 2 it was ungovernable. The same pattern ran everywhere. The empire built universities and law schools and sent its brightest colonial subjects to be educated in Britain, where they read John Stuart Mill and the history of the English constitutional struggles and the abolitionists, and where they encountered each other. Students from West Africa, the Caribbean, and India met in London boarding houses and debating societies and discovered they had the same argument to make. Pan-Africanism took shape in exactly those rooms. The first Pan-African conference was held in London in 1900, organized by a Trinidadian barrister, Henry Sylvester Williams. A series of congresses followed across the decades, and the 5th, held in Manchester in 1945, is the one that mattered most. Among those present were Kwame Nkrumah, who would lead Ghana to independence, Jomo Kenyatta, who would lead Kenya, and the American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. Within 15 years of that meeting in Manchester, both of those men were running countries. And the intellectual argument was being won long before the political one. The case that colonial rule was incompatible with the principles Britain claimed to stand for was made over and over in English in British publications using British precedents by people the British had educated. An empire that governs by consent and legitimacy rather than by permanent force is vulnerable to precisely that. Once enough people inside it stop believing it is justified and say so publicly and repeatedly, the cost of holding it rises past what anyone is willing to pay. Suez ended that illusion in a week. In 1956, the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. Britain and France, in secret coordination with Israel, arranged a pretext for military intervention to take the canal back. Militarily, it went reasonably well. Politically, it was a catastrophe. The United States, which had not been consulted and was furious, applied financial pressure directly, declining to support the pound as it came under attack and making clear that assistance depended on withdrawal. Britain withdrew. The Prime Minister resigned shortly afterwards. The lesson was not lost on anyone watching. Britain could no longer conduct a significant military operation against American disapproval. The independence of British power, which had been the foundation of everything since 1815, was over, and it had been demonstrated publicly. After Suez, decolonization accelerated enormously. Ghana became independent in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African colony to do so, under Kwame Nkrumah. In 1960, 17 African countries became independent in a single year, and Harold Macmillan told the South African Parliament that a wind of change was blowing through the continent and that the growth of national consciousness was a political fact which had to be accepted. Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone and Tanganyika in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, then the Caribbean, then Malaysia and Singapore, then the Gulf states, then the Pacific. By the mid-1970s, it was substantially finished. It was not all peaceful, and the exceptions deserved to be named rather than skated over because the retreat had a violent side that was carefully kept out of view at the time. In Malaya from 1948, Britain fought a 12-year campaign against a communist insurgency, involving the resettlement of around 500,000 rural Chinese Malayans into guarded villages. In Kenya from 1952, the response to the Mau Mau uprising among the Kikuyu involved a state of emergency, mass detention in a network of camps, and systematic abuse within them. The official figure for insurgents killed was around 11,000. Some historians argue the true toll across the emergency was far higher, and the estimates are contested. 32 European settlers were killed across the whole emergency. In 2011, during a legal case brought by elderly Kenyan claimants, it emerged that thousands of colonial-era files, removed from colonies at independence and long said not to exist, were held at a Foreign Office facility at Hanslope Park. They documented, among other things, the destruction of records at independence and the knowledge senior officials had of what was happening in the camps. In 2013, the British government reached a settlement paying around £20 million to over 5,000 Kenyan claimants, with a statement of regret in Parliament. The last significant act came on the 1st of July 1997, when Hong Kong was handed to China at the expiry of a 99-year lease on the new territories in a ceremony in the rain, with the last governor and the Prince of Wales sailing out of the harbor on the royal yacht. That is usually taken as the end. Britain retains 14 overseas territories: Gibraltar, the Falklands, Bermuda, and a scatter of small islands. The monarch remains head of state in a number of independent countries, and the Commonwealth, an association of 56 states, most of them former British territories, continues to exist and to hold meetings that are generally reported without much enthusiasm. So, what is left of it? The most obvious thing is the language you are listening to. English is spoken by well over 1 billion people, and the great majority of them did not learn it at home. It is the working language of aviation, of science, of the internet, of international business, and of the sea. That happened partly because of the empire and partly because of the American century that followed, and the two are not separable. The consequences run both ways. English gave people separated by hundreds of local languages a means of arguing with the empire in its own vocabulary, and independence movements across Africa and Asia were organized in it. It also displaced languages, and it carries a hierarchy inside it that people in many countries still feel. Then the law. Common law systems derived from English law operate in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Singapore, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Precedent, adversarial trial, habeas corpus. Then parliaments, which is the great irony of the whole thing. The Westminster model of government, complete with a speaker, a mace, a loyal opposition, and question time, was adopted by a remarkable number of newly independent states. Some of them have sustained it for 70 years, others have not, and the institutions bequeathed were frequently thin, having been extended only in the last decade or two before departure. Then the borders, and this is the heaviest inheritance. A great many of the world's disputed frontiers were drawn by British officials, often quickly, often from maps in offices far away, often cutting through communities or joining together peoples with nothing in common but the accident of falling inside the same line. Nigeria, Sudan, Iraq, Kashmir, the India-Pakistan border, the Israel-Palestine question. Where a line drawn in a hurry in 1947 or 1922 is producing consequences tonight, that is a British line. Then cricket and tea and the railways still running on tracks laid in the 1860s, and place names and Anglican cathedrals in tropical cities, and a curry house on nearly every British high street, and communities across Britain whose presence is the direct and entirely logical consequence of the empire having gone out to their grandparents first. That last one deserves its own moment because it is the point where the empire came home. In 1948, Parliament passed a British Nationality Act which confirmed that people across the colonies and the Commonwealth were British subjects with the right to enter and settle in the United Kingdom. That was not an accident or an oversight. Britain had lost enormous numbers of working-age men in the war and needed labor badly, and it was actively recruiting. In June of that same year, a ship called the Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury carrying several hundred passengers from the Caribbean, most of them from Jamaica, many of them ex-servicemen who had already served Britain in uniform. They had been taught in colonial schools to think of Britain as the mother country. A good many of them knew more English history than the people they met on arrival. What they found was a country that had not expected them, and that housed them badly, and that in many places refused them lodgings and jobs outright, with signs in windows that people still remember the wording of. Over the following 2 decades, migration continued from the Caribbean, from India and Pakistan, from Cyprus, from West Africa, and it built the communities that are now simply part of what Britain is. The politics tightened almost immediately. A series of immigration acts from 1962 onward progressively removed the right of entry that the 1948 Act had confirmed, and the debate around them was frequently ugly. And there was a long tail. In 2018, it emerged that people who had arrived legally as children in the 1950s and 60s and who had lived and worked in Britain their whole lives were being denied health care and housing, detained, and in some cases deported, because they could not produce documentation that had never been issued to them, and because the Home Office had destroyed the landing card records. It became known as the Windrush Scandal, and a compensation scheme followed. 70 years after the empire began to end, its subjects were still being asked to prove they belonged. And then the argument itself, which has become part of the legacy. Let me lay it out fairly, because it is worth understanding rather than picking a side of on impulse. One position holds that the empire, whatever its crimes, spread institutions of enormous value. Law, representative government, property rights, a global trading system, the English language, and that many former colonies have done well with them, and that it should be judged against the realistic alternatives of its time rather than against present-day standards, and that Britain's role in ending the slave trade deserves real weight. The opposing position holds that the empire was a system for transferring wealth from the governed to the governor, that the institutions were introduced late, thinly, and mostly for administrative convenience, that the wealth of Britain and the relative poverty of much of what it governed are causally connected, that famines and massacres and expropriations are not incidental blemishes but consequences of how the thing worked, and that the ledger approach is itself a way of avoiding the point, since nobody proposes a balance sheet for other historical crimes. And there is a third position, which I find the most useful, and which says the whole framing is wrong. The empire was not a project. It had no plan. It was assembled over 350 years by companies, adventurers, missionaries, settlers, soldiers, bureaucrats, and reluctant governments, frequently in contradiction with one another, frequently against the wishes of the London administrations that ended up responsible for the results. It contained the men who ran the slave ships and the men who ended the trade, sometimes in the same parliament, occasionally in the same family. Asking whether it was good or bad is a little like asking whether the 19th century was good or bad. It is not a thing with an intention that can be scored. What you can ask is far more useful. What did this specific policy do in this place to these people, and who benefited and who paid, and what would have happened otherwise? Those questions have answers, and the answers are different in different places, and doing that work is how history actually gets done. Let me bring you back now. Think of the people rather than the map. The woman in the Lancashire mill, breathing cotton dust for 30 years so the cloth could go to a market she would never see. The Bengali cultivator, in debt to a moneylender before the crop was in the ground, on land his family had worked for 100 years and did not own. The young man from Aberdeenshire, riding out on tour in the heat with a Bengali grammar in his bag, convinced he was being useful, and in some small ways being useful, and part of something enormous that he did not choose and could not see the shape of, the 300,000 households that gave up sugar in their tea in the 1790s because they had seen a diagram of a ship, the sailors of the West Africa Squadron, dying of fever off a coast they had been sent to patrol 40 years After their grandfathers had sailed the same water carrying the cargo they were now stopping. The million who died in Ireland within sight of the ports, and the million who left. The men who sailed from the Caribbean to Britain after 1948 on invitations they had every right to accept, having been taught in school that they were coming to the mother country. All of them are inside the same story, and no version of it that keeps only some of them is worth telling. The empire is gone. The maps with a quarter of the world in pink are in second-hand bookshops. The ships are scrapped, the cables are obsolete, the coaling stations are quiet, and the men who argued about all of it in Parliament are 2 centuries dead. And a kettle is boiling somewhere. A leaf from a plant native to China, sugar from a cane native to New Guinea, in a cup copying a Chinese design. Perfectly ordinary. Nobody thinking about it at all. That is how it ends, really. Not with a treaty, with something so thoroughly absorbed into daily life that it stops looking like history. You are here now, in the dark, in your own room, with your breathing already slower than it was when we started, and your body heavier against the bed. There is nothing more to follow. The ships have all come in. The story is finished, and you can set it down completely. Let the last of it go. The maps, the names, the dates. Let them drift off like the sound of a kettle in another room, in another house, a long way away. Rest now.